Welcome back. Well, a new survey by Afrobarometer says that only around 45% of South Africans, just under half, believe that people in southern Africa should be able to move freely across international borders to work in other countries. Interestingly, it seems the more educated people are, the more likely you are to oppose the free movement of people and insist on borders between countries in southern Africa. Now, you'll have seen, of course, perhaps some evidence that we have rising levels of what may be xenophobia in our society. Mikhail Moosa is a project leader at the South African Reconciliation Barometer, conducted this research. Mikhail, good afternoon to you and thank you for your time. You asked people about their attitudes towards people should be able to move freely across borders or not. What did you find?
Hi, Stephen. Thanks for having me. Yes, so the Afrobarometer survey, which was conducted in May and June of last year, one of the questions that we wanted to sort of pose to South Africans is what are their views on South Africans in the region? What do we think of other countries in the region and our place in the world as well? And regarding movement across borders, we found that about 45% of South Africans are actually supportive of cross-border movement, but actually a small majority of South Africans in our sample, 51%, say that they are actually in favor of limiting cross-border movement as well. So I think what you referred to there about sort of rising xenophobic sentiment, this maybe is quite a recent phenomenon, at least in sort of very political terms. But what we see is that a slightly larger share of South Africans would actually prefer to limit cross-border movement, but still about 45% would be in favor of supporting it.
It's actually, I have to tell you, I mean, these are conversations I've been following for many years. It's nearly half of people who believe we shouldn't actually have hard borders. That's actually quite a high percentage when you consider it. I mean, there's a sense of many things there. There's a sense of the economy. There's a sense of the lived experience that people do just move across borders. Many people have a family member from another country. I mean, it's quite a high figure. Nearly half think that the borders we have don't really matter.
Yeah, well, I mean, if you think of historically why those borders were constructed as well, I don't think they have as much relevance as they perhaps once did. If you consider South Africa's borders with Lesotho or Eswatini, for example, those are very unique in global circumstances. We have a very close relationship with Botswana, for example. As you quite rightly mentioned, there's a lot of movement between those. So I think South Africans recognize that we are a sort of regional powerhouse where lots of people move in and out of for various reasons, and that this is something that we should be supportive of and should allow for. And actually having very strict border regulations is not necessarily conducive to a more socially cohesive or productive society as well.
I mean, I'm always fascinated by this because if you look at the unemployment we have in our country, if you Google the top 10 countries with the top 10 youth unemployment, it's South Africa, Botswana, Eswatini, Namibia, Zimbabwe. I mean, the point I'm trying to make is that at least since probably the discovery of diamonds in Kimberley and the colonial economy, we've been a Southern African economy anyway.
That's exactly right, and I think it is what we're seeing recently, certainly from some political leaders and some other groups as well, for us to be quite inward-looking in terms of how we develop our economy. I think it's just ahistorical in terms of how South Africa has developed. But what we do also see in the survey is that South Africans generally do favor a sort of protectionist economy, so prioritizing local producers, limiting certain foreign-owned goods from moving into the country, and also being more reliant on our own funding than relying on other countries. So we do see some perceptions here from South Africans that they would prefer to do things on their own, to not rely on others. But of course, it's not quite as extreme as perhaps some people would like us to make out to believe.
You also asked people about the economic models of other countries, and this is fascinating. So, I mean, these are sort of a very broad brush way of looking at it. You've got the United States economic model, if that is a model, which I suppose we would call to oversimplify capitalism, and China, which again to oversimplifies, well, sort of capitalism, although that's a very controversial thing to say. It's a sort of state-led capitalism, if you like. You found more people prefer the US model to China's economic model. How stark was that difference?
Yeah, so I don't think this was too surprising a finding for us, considering that the U.S.-style economy is very much the dominant one throughout the world. So reliance on free trade, on sort of liberal economic principles. But the difference that we found between people favoring the U.S. or China is about 15 or 17 percentage points. So 20% of South Africans said that we should look towards China, and 37% said we should look towards the U.S. So I think this sort of indicates that South Africans, broadly speaking, are generally accepting of the sort of dominant liberal economic principles that the U.S. tries to espouse around the world, but that there is quite a high degree of admiration for the sort of state-led development that China has really emphasized over the last few years. But importantly as well, I think a small minority of people in our sample, about 11%, said that we actually shouldn't rely on other country models. We should instead develop our own. And I think that's also quite an interesting finding to sort of reflect on in terms of how we developed after the COVID-19 pandemic.
Do those views on economic model, the American model, the Chinese model, again, oversimplification, do they spill over into how people feel about the US and how people feel about China?
Yes, broadly speaking, we see some correlation between the two. So we also asked South Africans in our sample, how do you view these sort of global economic powers? And it's pretty much in line with how people think our development model should be. The United States came out as the most favorable, so just under 50% of our samples said that they have quite a positive view of the U.S., but very closely behind is China with about 40%. So about 2 in 5 South Africans say that they have a very sort of positive association with China. And then looking at some other countries as well and regional organizations, generally quite supportive of the UN, of the African Union, of SADC. And interestingly, this survey obviously took place well ahead of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but Russia was viewed perhaps as the least positive, if we can put it that way, in terms of the global economic powers.
That's a fascinating finding. I was going to ask, and then I wasn't because you said you did the survey so long last year. So of all the models, people like Russia's the least. This is people in South Africa.
Yeah, well, I think a lot of the sort of support maybe that we've seen for Russia over the last few months, despite its atrocities in Ukraine, has been a very sort of nostalgic view, one that's sort of steeped in history of their support for the armed struggle in South Africa, but not really based in the society which Russia is today. So I think more people were positive about Russia in our survey than were negative. But the amount of people who are positive, just around 30% of our sample, was far lower than those people who are positive about China or the United States. So I think the ability of those two countries in particular to create wealth, to create jobs, to grow the economy, in contrast to Russia, which has remained quite an autocratic society where people are quite upset about a large number of things. I think South Africans, generally speaking, at least in our survey, have shown that they would much prefer a model like the United States or China.
Mikhail Moosa, thanks very much indeed. Project leader at the South African Reconciliation Barometer. Really appreciate the time. Very interesting research.